September 25, 1986. Jalalabad, Afghanistan. 35 Afghan fighters crouched in mountain brush, watching 3 Soviet Mi-24 helicopter gunships descend toward the airfield. For 7 brutal years, these flying tanks had terrorized their homeland with absolute impunity. The Afghans called them Shaitan Arba, Satan's chariot. Engineer Ghaffar raised a green tube to his shoulder. The CIA had given him one additional item, a video camera to document what happened next. His first shot misfired. The missile bounced uselessly across the rocks. But his second shot would mark the beginning of the end for Soviet air dominance in Afghanistan. And some would argue, the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union itself. 3 helicopters approached, 3 missiles fired, 3 explosions. Within 13 days, the entire course of the Cold War's bloodiest proxy conflict would shift. This is the story of how American ingenuity armed farmers with a weapon that shot down 269 Soviet aircraft and changed the balance of global power. December 1979. The Soviet 40th Army rolled across the Afghan border. 80,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, and a weapon the Mujahideen had never encountered, the Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter. NATO called it the Hind. The Afghans had another name, the Devil's Chariot. This wasn't just another helicopter. The Mi-24 was a flying fortress, the most heavily armed and armored attack helicopter in the world. Its titanium cockpit could withstand 50 caliber rounds. It carried a 12.7mm Gatling gun, unguided rockets, and anti-tank missiles. And it could transport 8 fully equipped soldiers while providing devastating fire support. Soviet doctrine was brutally simple. Use helicopters to control the valleys, strafe villages suspected of harboring resistance, and make it impossible for the Mujahideen to move during daylight hours. By 1985, the Soviets had deployed hundreds of Mi-24s across Afghanistan. They flew with impunity. The Mujahideen had weapons, AK-47s, RPG-7s, and Soviet-supplied SA-7 Strela shoulder-fired missiles left over from earlier conflicts. But these were woefully inadequate. The SA-7 had a 3% kill rate against the Mi-24, 3%. The British-supplied blowpipe missile system was so complicated and unreliable that fighters abandoned it in frustration. The RPG-7 required a near-impossible lucky shot at close range. Mohammad Yusuf, the Pakistani ISI officer coordinating Mujahideen operations, later wrote that in April 1986, hard battles were being fought in the valleys. The Mujahideen could not continue. They were exhausted. Soviet air power was crushing them. The helicopter became a symbol of Soviet technological superiority and Afghan helplessness. But in Washington, a debate was reaching its conclusion. A debate about whether to give Afghan farmers access to one of America's most advanced weapons systems. A decision that would prove more consequential than anyone imagined. April 1986. CIA headquarters, Langley, Virginia. For 6 years, American policy in Afghanistan had been simple. Bleed the Soviets, but don't provoke them into widening the war. Supply the Mujahideen with enough weapons to make the occupation painful, but not enough to win decisively. That policy was called containment. President Ronald Reagan wanted something different. He wanted victory. Operation Cyclone, the CIA's covert program to arm the Afghan resistance, was already the most expensive covert operation in American history. But Reagan authorized a fundamental shift in strategy. The United States would provide the Mujahideen with weapons capable of winning, not just surviving. The weapon in question was the FIM-92 Stinger missile. The debate within the CIA was fierce. The Stinger was cutting-edge American technology, a fire-and-forget infrared-guided surface-to-air missile that could track and destroy aircraft autonomously. If one fell into Soviet hands, they could reverse-engineer it. If one ended up with Iran or terrorist groups, it could threaten civilian aircraft worldwide. The risks were enormous, but the opportunity was greater. Here's what made the Stinger revolutionary. It weighed 35 pounds. It was 5 feet long. A soldier could carry it, aim it, fire it, and be reloading 30 seconds later. Unlike earlier systems that required the operator to guide the missile manually, the Stinger locked onto the heat signature of an aircraft engine and tracked it automatically. Training was astonishingly simple. In Pakistan, CIA instructors taught Mujahideen fighters using a flashlight moved slowly across a white bedsheet as a simulator. Total cost, about $100. Total training time, a few weeks. The cost of a single Stinger missile in 1986, $38,000. The cost of a single Mi-24 helicopter, approximately $12 million. On September 26, 1986, one day after engineer Ghaffar fired those first 3 shots, Soviet operations across Afghanistan ground to a halt. Airfields locked down. Flight patterns changed overnight. Because the Soviets suddenly realized they were facing a weapon that could genuinely threaten their control of Afghan airspace. Let's talk about what made the Stinger so deadly. The FIM-92 Stinger was the product of 2 decades of American engineering, designed specifically to counter Soviet helicopter and low-altitude aircraft tactics. It represented a quantum leap over previous man-portable air defense systems. The missile traveled at over Mach 2, faster than 1,500 miles per hour. Its infrared seeker could distinguish between an aircraft engine and decoy flares. Its range extended to over 3 miles, and it could engage targets up to 12,800 feet in altitude. But the real innovation was psychological. Previous systems like the SA-7 required the operator to remain exposed while guiding the missile. The Stinger was fire and forget. The operator could shoot and immediately take cover. This meant a small team of fighters could fire multiple missiles in rapid succession, then disappear into the mountains before Soviet forces could respond. The Soviets had built their entire Afghan air strategy around the assumption that helicopters could operate without significant threat. The Mi-24 was designed to absorb ground fire from rifles and machine guns. It was never designed to evade heat-seeking missiles traveling at supersonic speeds. The CIA's plan was carefully orchestrated. They would supply approximately 2,000 to 2,500 Stinger missiles over the next 3 years. Training would be conducted in Pakistan by ISI officers who had been trained by American advisors. And critically, the first uses would be documented, both to prove the weapon's effectiveness and to maintain plausible deniability about direct American involvement. Engineer Ghaffar, a commander in the Hezb-e-Islami faction, was chosen for the first deployment. He was given a video camera along with his Stinger missiles. What happened on September 25, 1986, would be recorded for history and watched in horror by Soviet military planners in Moscow within days. The age of Soviet air superiority was about to end in a spectacular display of fire and smoke. Jalalabad Airport, eastern Afghanistan. Late afternoon. 35 Mujahideen fighters had been positioned since dawn. They carried 5 Stinger missiles and 3 launchers. Their position was approximately 1.5 kilometers northeast of the runway, hidden in thick brush that provided concealment but clear sightlines to the airport approach path. The fighters were organized into 3 fire teams, arranged in a triangular formation. Each team consisted of 3 shooters and 2 men carrying additional missiles for rapid reloading. This wasn't a random ambush. This was a carefully coordinated military operation based on CIA tactical doctrine. The intelligence was solid. Soviet Mi-24s followed predictable patterns. Late afternoon flights returned from missions in the Khyber Pass region. They approached the airfield from the northeast, descended gradually, and made long, straight landing approaches. For a heat-seeking missile, they were nearly perfect targets. Slow-moving, low-altitude engines at full power. At approximately 4:47 in the afternoon, 3 Mi-24s appeared on the horizon. Engineer Ghaffar gave the command. Fire. What happened next was captured on video and confirmed by American satellite reconnaissance that happened to pass over at that exact moment. Ghaffar squeezed the trigger on his Stinger launcher. Nothing. The missile malfunctioned, a catastrophic failure. It tumbled out of the tube and bounced across the rocks. For a heart-stopping moment, the entire operation seemed doomed. But the second and third shooters had already acquired their targets. 2 missiles streaked into the sky, white contrails arcing upward at impossible speed. The first Mi-24 exploded. The missile struck the engine compartment. The helicopter disintegrated in mid-air. A ball of orange flame and black smoke, debris raining down across the valley. The second Mi-24 attempted evasive maneuvers. Too late. The Stinger's seeker had locked on. The missile struck the tail rotor assembly. The helicopter spun violently, corkscrewed into the ground, and detonated on impact. The third helicopter tried to flee. Ghaffar had already reloaded. He raised the launcher, acquired the target, and fired again. This time, the weapon performed flawlessly. The missile covered the distance in seconds. The Mi-24's cockpit exploded. The helicopter went down in flames half a kilometer from the airport perimeter. Time elapsed from first shot to third kill, approximately 90 seconds. In 90 seconds, 3 $12 million Soviet helicopters and their crews were obliterated by weapons that cost $38,000 each. Ghaffar later told Stars and Stripes in a 2008 interview that it was a very good day. They were very, very happy. The helicopters were a big problem for them. He had no idea that his very good day had just rewritten the strategic calculus of the entire Afghan conflict. The Soviet response was immediate and revealed just how devastating the psychological impact had been. Within hours, Jalalabad airport was locked down. Within 24 hours, new flight protocols were transmitted to every Soviet airbase in Afghanistan. Within 1 week, Soviet air operations had fundamentally changed. The new protocols were draconian. No more long, straight landing approaches. Helicopters were ordered to make steep, spiral descents from high altitude. Difficult for pilots, harder on aircraft, but reducing exposure to ground-launched missiles. Mandatory flare escorts. Every flight now required additional helicopters flying alongside, continuously launching infrared decoy flares. This doubled the number of aircraft needed for any mission and cut operational capacity in half. Night flights only for cargo operations. But Afghanistan's mountainous terrain made night flying extraordinarily dangerous. Crash rates increased. Low-altitude tactics. Helicopters were ordered to fly as close to the ground as possible, nap of the earth flying, to reduce missile lock-on time. But this made them vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire. Jalalabad airport remained closed for an entire month. Soviet commanders were terrified that more Stinger-equipped teams were waiting in the mountains. They were right. The intelligence war escalated immediately. The Soviet Union offered the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, the highest state honor, to any soldier who could capture a functioning Stinger missile. Soviet Spetsnaz special forces units were redirected from counterinsurgency operations to hunting for Stinger caches. On January 5, 1987, a Soviet Spetsnaz team got lucky. They captured a functioning Stinger during a raid on a Mujahideen supply depot. The missile was immediately flown to Moscow for analysis. Soviet engineers tore it apart. They studied the guidance system, the propellant, the warhead design, the infrared seeker's discrimination algorithms. They incorporated lessons into upgrades for the Su-25 ground attack aircraft and developed new countermeasures for the Mi-24. But it was too late. By the time Soviet engineers had finished their analysis, hundreds more Stingers had already been distributed across Afghanistan. By the end of 1986, just 3 months after that first strike, Soviet forces had lost 23 aircraft to ground fire. The CIA's first Sting exhibit later noted that rebel morale had soared overnight. But the true cascade of losses was only beginning. The statistical record tells a stark story. September to December 1986. 23 Soviet aircraft destroyed by ground fire, most attributed to Stinger missiles. January to June 1987. The rate accelerated. Mujahideen commanders reported receiving additional Stinger shipments through Pakistani ISI channels. By mid-1987, it was estimated that over 150 missiles had been distributed to various resistance factions. Summer 1987. The losses became catastrophic. Soviet forces were losing an average of 1.5 aircraft per day. Helicopters, ground attack aircraft, even high-altitude bombers attempting close air support missions. According to ISI statistics analyzed later, in the first 10 months after the Stinger's introduction, Mujahideen fighters fired 187 missiles. The confirmed kill rate was approximately 75%, roughly 140 aircraft destroyed. By the end of the war in 1989, the total had reached 269 confirmed Soviet aircraft losses attributable to Stinger missiles. Think about what that means. 269 aircraft. Each one represented millions of dollars in hardware. Each one carried highly trained crews, pilots who had spent years in training, weapons officers, crew chiefs. The human cost alone was devastating to Soviet military morale. But the strategic impact went far beyond mere numbers. Entire regions of Afghanistan became effective no-fly zones. Soviet commanders couldn't risk sending helicopters into areas where Stinger teams were known to operate. This meant ground forces lost their primary tactical advantage: air mobility and close air support. The Soviets tried everything. They installed additional armor on helicopters, but the added weight degraded performance. They developed infrared jammers, but these were heavy, power-intensive, and only marginally effective against the Stinger's advanced seeker. They experimented with flying at extreme low altitude, but this made aircraft vulnerable to heavy machine guns and increased crash rates dramatically. Soviet pilots began refusing missions. Morale collapsed. A weapons system that had once been a symbol of Soviet technological superiority had become a flying coffin. The CIA had calculated that the Stinger would be effective. What they hadn't fully anticipated was the psychological effect. The way a relatively inexpensive weapon could completely neutralize a multi-billion-dollar air force and shatter the confidence of an entire military command structure. The Stinger didn't just shoot down helicopters. It fundamentally altered the strategic equation of the Afghan-Soviet war. Before September 1986, Soviet strategy relied on a clear formula. Control the cities and roads with ground forces. Control everything else with air power. Use helicopters to transport troops rapidly, provide close air support, and make it impossible for Mujahideen to mass forces in daylight. After September 1986, that formula was obsolete. Soviet ground forces found themselves isolated. Supply convoys that had once enjoyed helicopter escort were now on their own. Outposts that had relied on air resupply were cut off. Mujahideen fighters who had previously scattered at the sound of rotor blades now held their ground and held their fire until aircraft were within Stinger range. The economic cost was staggering. Each Mi-24 cost approximately $12 million in 1986 dollars. Each Su-25 ground attack aircraft, $11 million. Even accounting for inflation and exchange rates, the Soviet Union was losing billions of rubles in destroyed aircraft. But more importantly, they were losing something that couldn't be replaced: experienced pilots and aircrew. Training a helicopter pilot takes years. Training a combat-experienced helicopter pilot takes a decade. The Soviets were losing irreplaceable human capital at a rate their military academies couldn't match. Soviet military planners faced an impossible dilemma. They could continue air operations and accept catastrophic losses, or they could ground their aircraft and concede air superiority, which meant conceding any hope of military victory. The ripple effects extended beyond Afghanistan. NATO military analysts were watching closely. The Stinger had proven that modern man-portable air defense systems could neutralize helicopter-based tactics, the same tactics Soviet forces planned to use in any potential European conflict. If Afghan farmers could shoot down Mi-24s, what would professional NATO forces do to Soviet air assets? In Moscow, the Politburo was receiving increasingly dire reports. The war that Leonid Brezhnev had promised would be over in months was now in its 7th year. Soviet casualties were mounting, the economic drain was enormous, and now the one tactical advantage Soviet forces had enjoyed, air superiority, had been neutralized by a weapon that cost less than a luxury car. By early 1988, the debate in Moscow was no longer about how to win in Afghanistan. It was about how to withdraw without appearing to have lost. The Stinger had made that question urgent and unavoidable. March 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He inherited an economy in crisis, a political system riddled with corruption, and a war in Afghanistan that was bleeding the nation dry. Gorbachev introduced two concepts that would reshape Soviet policy: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He believed the Soviet system could be reformed, modernized, made more efficient. But reform required resources, and resources were being consumed by a war that couldn't be won. The Afghan war was costing the Soviet Union an estimated $3 to $4 billion annually, and that was before the Stinger changed the calculus. After September 1986, those costs exploded. Aircraft losses alone represented billions in destroyed equipment. The cost of developing countermeasures, upgrading existing aircraft, and training replacement crews added billions more. But the real cost was political. Soviet casualties, officially undisclosed but estimated at over 15,000 dead, were creating domestic unrest. Soldiers returned home with stories of unwinnable battles, corrupt leadership, and hopeless tactics. The myth of Soviet military invincibility was crumbling. Gorbachev faced pressure from multiple directions. Hardliners in the military insisted that withdrawal would be seen as weakness. Reformers argued that the war was undermining everything Gorbachev was trying to achieve. And the international community, particularly the United States under Ronald Reagan, was making it clear that détente was impossible as long as Soviet forces occupied Afghanistan. February 1988. Gorbachev made the decision. Soviet forces would withdraw from Afghanistan. The announcement framed the decision as a political settlement, but everyone understood the truth. The Soviet Union was admitting defeat. Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze later reflected that the decision to leave Afghanistan was the first and most difficult step. Everything else flowed from that. The withdrawal took nearly a year. Soviet forces began a phased retreat, fighting defensive actions as they pulled back to major cities, then to air bases, then across the border. The final Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan on February 15, 1989. The Soviet 40th Army had entered Afghanistan with 80,000 men, hundreds of aircraft, and overwhelming technological superiority. They left with over 15,000 dead, 53,000 wounded, 333 helicopters destroyed, and 118 jets lost. But here's the question that haunted CIA analysts for years. How many of those losses, and how much of that defeat, could be traced back to a $38,000 missile that changed the course of the war? Military analysts coined a term for what happened in Afghanistan: the Stinger effect. The concept was simple but profound. A relatively inexpensive weapon, deployed in sufficient numbers, could neutralize a vastly more expensive weapons system and, by extension, an entire military strategy. The broader implications were staggering. In military academies worldwide, the Stinger became a case study in asymmetric warfare. It demonstrated that technological superiority alone wasn't enough to guarantee victory. It showed that mobility, Rapid deployment and effective training could allow a less advanced force to defeat a superpower's cutting-edge technology. The numbers told the story. Total Soviet helicopter losses in Afghanistan, 333. Total Soviet jet losses, 118. Losses after Stinger introduction from September 1986 to February 1989, 269 confirmed. Percentage of total losses post-Stinger, over 50%. Estimated cost of destroyed aircraft, billions of dollars. Cost of Stinger missiles delivered, approximately $76 to $95 million. 2,000 to 2,500 missiles at $38,000 each. Return on investment. For less than $100 million, the United States had helped destroy over $3 billion in Soviet aircraft and fundamentally altered the outcome of a war. But the Stinger effect extended beyond Afghanistan. NATO forces immediately began integrating man-portable air defense systems into their tactical doctrine. The US Army expanded Stinger production and deployed the system throughout Europe. The assumption that helicopters could dominate the modern battlefield was forever challenged. Soviet military doctrine was forced to adapt. The next generation of Russian attack helicopters, the Mi-28 and K-50, incorporated lessons from Afghanistan. Better armor, improved countermeasures, reduced infrared signatures. But these improvements came too late to change the outcome in Afghanistan, and they came at enormous cost to an already struggling Soviet economy. The Stinger had proven a fundamental principle of modern warfare. In the age of precision weapons, no platform is invulnerable. But there was another legacy of the Stinger program, one that would haunt American policymakers for decades. February 15, 1989. The last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge out of Afghanistan. The war was over. The Mujahideen had won. And somewhere in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan, over 600 Stinger missiles remained unaccounted for. This was the CIA's worst nightmare. The Stinger program had always carried enormous risk. From the beginning, American officials understood that providing advanced weapons to guerrilla forces meant losing control of those weapons. But the potential benefit, defeating the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, had outweighed the risk. Now that the Soviets were gone, the risk remained. And it was growing. The CIA launched an immediate buyback program. The offer was simple. The United States would pay $100,000 to $150,000 for every Stinger missile returned, nearly 4 times the original purchase price. No questions asked. Complete amnesty. Some missiles were recovered. Mujahideen commanders who had good relationships with CIA contacts turned in their unused weapons. Pakistani ISI officials helped facilitate returns. By the early 1990s, the CIA had recovered several hundred Stingers, but hundreds more remained missing. Where did they go? Iran. Evidence suggested that some missiles had been sold to Iranian intermediaries, possibly with the knowledge of certain Mujahideen factions, black market arms dealers. Stingers appeared on international weapons markets, with asking prices ranging from $50,000 to $200,000. Other militant groups. There were reports of Stingers being offered to separatist movements in Kashmir, Chechnya, and elsewhere. The worst-case scenario haunted aviation security officials. A Stinger missile used against a civilian airliner. The weapon was designed to defeat military aircraft with countermeasures and evasive capabilities. Against a civilian plane on a predictable approach path to a major airport, a Stinger would be devastatingly effective. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, American intelligence agencies tracked rumors and reports of Stinger sightings. Airport security was enhanced worldwide. Diplomatic pressure was applied to countries suspected of harboring the missing weapons. The Stinger program had achieved its strategic objective. It had helped defeat the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. But the unintended consequences would shape American foreign policy and security concerns for the next 3 decades. The Soviet withdrawal did not bring peace to Afghanistan. It brought chaos. With the common enemy gone, the Mujahideen factions turned on each other. The country descended into civil war. Warlords carved out territories. The weapons that had been used to fight the Soviets, including those Stinger missiles, were now used in internal conflicts. In this power vacuum, a new force emerged: the Taliban. By 1996, the Taliban had captured Kabul and controlled most of Afghanistan. Their regime was brutal, isolationist, and provided sanctuary to international terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda. September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon were planned and coordinated from Afghanistan. The United States, which had armed the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, now found itself invading Afghanistan to fight forces that had emerged from the chaos following the Soviet withdrawal. The irony was not lost on historians. American weapons, including possibly some of those unaccounted for Stingers, were now potentially in the hands of forces fighting against American troops. In 2008, Stars and Stripes tracked down Engineer Ghaffar, the man who had fired the first Stinger shots in 1986. He was living near Jalalabad, the same city where he had achieved his very good day 22 years earlier. American forces had established a major base there. Ghaffar gave an interview on the American base. He described the day he shot down 3 Mi-24s. He talked about the war against the Soviets, and he reflected on what had happened to his country since. The Stinger had helped win a war, but it hadn't brought peace. The CIA's first Sting exhibit in their museum includes the video camera that recorded that first attack in 1986. Next to it, a plaque reads, "The first 3 Stingers fired took down 3 gunships." Rebel morale soared overnight. Devastating Soviet losses mounted. A Soviet retreat was within sight. But it doesn't mention what came after. The Stinger in Afghanistan was one piece of a much larger story: the endgame of the Cold War. December 1991. The Soviet Union officially dissolved. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War, 44 years of ideological conflict, nuclear brinkmanship, and proxy wars across the globe, was over. Could the Stinger missile take credit for ending the Cold War? No. That would be a vast oversimplification. The Soviet Union collapsed due to systemic economic failures, political corruption, nationalist movements within its republics, and the cumulative cost of decades of military competition with the West. But the Stinger was part of that cumulative cost. The Afghan war drained Soviet resources at a critical moment. It exposed the limitations of Soviet military power. It demonstrated that American technology could counter Soviet conventional superiority. And it contributed to the sense within the Soviet leadership that the old ways, military domination, ideological expansion, closed systems, were no longer sustainable. President George H.W. Bush declared in 1992, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War." The victory had many fathers: containment policy, the arms race, Radio-Free Europe, the Strategic Defense Initiative, diplomatic pressure, economic competition. And yes, a $38,000 missile that shot down 269 Soviet aircraft in the mountains of Afghanistan. But history has a way of repeating itself. The lessons of the Stinger, both its successes and its unintended consequences, would resurface in a conflict that began 33 years after Engineer Ghaffar's very good day. February 24, 2022. Russian forces invaded Ukraine in the largest European military conflict since World War II. Russian helicopters, successors to the Mi-24s that terrorized Afghanistan, swept across the Ukrainian border, supporting armored columns driving toward Kyiv. The American response included a familiar weapon: the FIM-92 Stinger missile. Within weeks of the invasion, the United States and NATO allies had committed thousands of Stinger missiles to Ukraine. Ukrainian forces, hastily trained on the weapon system, began engaging Russian helicopters and low-altitude aircraft. The results were devastating for the Russians. By mid-2022, Russia had lost dozens of helicopters and aircraft to man-portable air defense systems, including Stingers. Russian pilots reported the same psychological impact their Soviet predecessors had experienced in Afghanistan. Fear of flying low-altitude missions, degraded operational effectiveness, and plummeting morale. The parallels were striking. Same weapon, updated versions, but fundamentally the same system. Same enemy, Russian and Soviet forces using similar tactics. Same result, catastrophic losses forcing tactical adaptation. The Stinger had proven, once again, that technological superiority in one domain could be neutralized by effective deployment of asymmetric weapons. Military analysts began talking about a second Stinger effect, the way man-portable systems were once again reshaping modern battlefield dynamics. But there was one critical difference. This time, the United States knew exactly where the weapons were going and maintained much tighter control over distribution and accountability. The lessons of those 600 missing missiles from Afghanistan had been learned. September 25, 1986. Engineer Ghaffar raised a green tube to his shoulder and fired a missile that would help change the course of the Cold War. The statistics are clear. 269 Soviet aircraft destroyed by Stinger missiles in Afghanistan. Over 50% of all Soviet aircraft losses in the war occurred after the Stinger's introduction. $3 billion in destroyed Soviet military hardware. Cost to the United States, less than $100 million. But numbers alone don't capture the full story. The Stinger didn't just shoot down helicopters. It demonstrated that American ingenuity could arm freedom fighters to defeat a superpower's conventional military advantages. It proved that asymmetric warfare, the right weapon in the right hands at the right time, could alter strategic outcomes far beyond the immediate battlefield. It contributed to the Soviet decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, which contributed to the broader unraveling of Soviet power, which contributed to the end of the Cold War. But it also demonstrated the unintended consequences of proxy warfare. Those 600 missing missiles. The chaos that followed the Soviet withdrawal. The rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The events of September 11, 2001. The 20-year American war in Afghanistan that followed. The CIA Museum's first Sting exhibit preserves that moment. Engineer Ghaffar's video camera, satellite photographs of the burning helicopters, a disarmed Stinger missile. The plaque reads, "Rebel morale soared overnight. Devastating Soviet losses mounted. A Soviet retreat was within sight. It's a monument to victory. But it's also a reminder of complexity, that in war, especially in Cold War proxy conflicts, victories carry costs that extend decades into the future. Today, in conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East, the principles demonstrated by the Stinger program remain relevant. Technology can be countered. Superpowers can be challenged. Wars can be won or lost by weapons that cost a fraction of the systems they defeat. That's the legacy of September 25, 1986. The day 35 Afghan fighters with $38,000 American missiles shot down 3 Soviet helicopters and helped shoot down an empire. The day a simple weapon changed the balance of the Cold War and proved that sometimes the most powerful force on the battlefield isn't the biggest army or the most advanced technology. Sometimes it's a farmer with a green tube who knows exactly when to fire.